Buenas noches. Mi nombre es Antonio Escudero, yo presido la Comisión de Derecho Mercantil de la Academia de Jurisprudencia y Legislación de Puerto Rico. Y esta noche pues le traemos una charla como nuestra aportación al diálogo que se está generando en Puerto Rico sobre los cryptocurrencies. Y esto pues va a ser Spanglish. Voy a cambiar al inglés because our guest has to understand what I'm going to say. That's not the real reason. The real reason is that I could not find a translation for his commission. So it's the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, but I have no idea how to translate commodity or futures in Spanish, and I could not find it. So thank you for being with us tonight. James McDonald joined the commission from the U.S. Attorney's Office from the Southern District of New York. He served there as an assistant U.S. attorney. And most recently, before joining it, he served in the Public Corruption Unit. Earlier, he served as a law clerk to the Honorable John Roberts, Jr., Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And then he also clerked for a judge in the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He graduated from Harvard College and the University of Virginia, UVA School of Law. Previously, he served in the office of the White House Counsel as Deputy Associate Counsel. And he also worked for the law firm of Williams and Connolly. He comes to us from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he was also a visiting professor at the University of Tulsa College of Law. So, with no further ado, I introduce to you Jamie McDonald. Welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. So I'm here today to talk about virtual currencies, to talk about Bitcoin, to talk about distributed ledger technology. As you just heard, I'm the Director of Enforcement at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is the U.S. federal regulator that regulates the commodities and the derivatives markets. My thought here is that I'll start with a few remarks, but I want to leave plenty of time for questions from you. I'd like to have a discussion at the end of this to the extent that you guys have questions. So my thought is I'll start with my thoughts about virtual currency, about regulation, and how markets can be regulated by the regulators who are responsible for overseeing those markets in a way that's balanced, in a way that balances the need for appropriate regulation but without squelching innovation. And a little bit of, I'll offer you a few thoughts that I have based on our experience, which is dealing directly with Bitcoin's most recently with respect to the Bitcoin futures market, which is one that we directly oversee. So I'll start with a few remarks, but if you guys have questions, I'd really like to hear them, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. I understand we have a number of members from the innovation community here, particularly from you guys. I'd like to hear what you're seeing on the ground. So I'd like this to be a discussion, but if you'll permit me, I'll start with a few opening remarks, so thank you. Emerging financial technologies are taking us into a new chapter of economic history. They're impacting trading, markets, and the entire financial landscape with far-ranging implications for capital formation and risk transfer. These developments include machine learning and artificial intelligence, algorithm-based trading, data analytics, smart contracts, and distributed ledger technologies. These technologies are challenging traditional market infrastructure. They're transforming the world around us. And these technologies are having an equally transformative impact on capital and derivatives markets. Developments in this space even have us rethinking the very nature of money, how we transact it, how we can more efficiently engage in economic activity. Today, I'm going to talk about one particular form of financial technology, distributed ledger technologies, virtual currency, and in particular, Bitcoin. Broadly speaking, Virtual currencies are a digital representation of value that may function as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, or a store of value. Virtual currencies generally run on a decentralized peer-to-peer network of computers, which rely on certain network participants to validate and log transactions on a permanent public distributed ledger, commonly known as a distributed ledger. The one that underpins Bitcoin is, we call it the blockchain. Supporters of virtual currency see a technological solution to a traditional framework and a traditional problem that's sometimes referred to as the double spend problem. This has required a trusted central authority to ensure that an entity is capable of, and in fact does, engage in a valid transaction. Under this traditional model, there's been a need for a trusted intermediary, for example, a bank or a financial institution, to serve as a gatekeeper to verify transactions and many other economic activities. Virtual currencies seek to replace the need for a central authority or intermediary with a decentralized, rules-based, and open consensus mechanism. An array of thoughtful business, technology, academic, and policy leaders have highlighted some of the possible benefits from such an innovation. This includes how market participants conduct transactions, transfer ownership, and power peer-to-peer applications and economic systems. Others, however, argue this is all hype. The current interest in virtual currencies is overblown. They say that virtual currencies perform no socially valuable function, and worse, they can be used to evade laws or support illicit activity. They say that virtual currencies are like the tulip bubble, the famous tulip bubble from the 17th century. And so some of these people say that virtual currencies should be banned, like some countries have done. So there's clearly no shortage of opinion on virtual currencies, distributed ledgers, and Bitcoin. Tonight, I want to explore with you some of these opinions and some of the thinking behind those opinions. And specifically, I want to explore that thinking from the perspective of a US regulator, and in particular, from the perspective of market surveillance and enforcement, which is my perspective. So as you heard, for a little more than a year, I've served as the Director of Enforcement at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. We call it the CFTC, in part so that it can be translated. CFTC, we could have said. So I've been there for a little more than a year, and the CFTC was founded in 1975 as an independent agency. It's composed of 5 commissioners, chosen by the President and confirmed by the Senate. No more than 3 of the 5 commissioners can come from the same political party as the President. And it's got about 700 career staff, and about 200 of those are in the Division of Enforcement. Although it's called the Division of Enforcement actually encompasses enforcement, investigation, and surveillance. And that's the division that I run. So I've talked about the CFTC. I now have to give an important disclaimer, which is that these views are my own. They're not necessarily the views of the Commission, but I offer them for you. I offer them to you as my perspective. The CFTC regulates markets for commodity derivative transactions, such as exchanges trading futures and options on oil, natural gas, wheat, gold, silver, other commodities like that. It also oversees some of the world's largest financial markets in listed futures and over-the-counter swaps for interest rates, credit defaults, and foreign exchange. And for the most part, these markets are commercial risk transfer and institutional trading markets. Our jurisdiction at the CFTC centers around commodities. One way to think about it is if you're familiar with the SEC in the United States, the SEC regulates securities, the CFTC regulates commodities, and the distinction between securities and commodities is something that we can talk about a little later if you're interested. The definition of commodity includes physical goods like wheat, cotton, gold, or oil. It includes traditional currencies and things like interest rates. And it also includes virtual currencies like Bitcoin. at least where the virtual currency is designed to serve as a store of value, a medium of exchange, or a unit of account, and not to serve some capital raising function. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is working with our fellow regulators to determine whether any particular virtual currency is operating as a commodity in the form that I've just described, or a security. And one way that you know that it may be operating as a security is if it's intended to raise capital, if it's like an initial coin offering. So it's not intended to be used as a medium of exchange or a store of value or a unit of account, but it's actually intended to raise capital for some enterprise. If it's an ICO, that's the SEC's jurisdiction. If it's a commodity, that's within our jurisdiction. We at the CFTC, we generally have regulatory authority over commodity derivatives. Those are contracts on the commodity like futures or swaps. But we have enforcement authority over all commodities, meaning if we see fraud or manipulation in any commodity, we can bring an enforcement action. So what does all of that have to do with Bitcoin? Well, in 2015, the CFTC defined Bitcoin as a commodity. There were several Bitcoin derivatives contracts that were listed after the CFTC defined Bitcoin as a commodity in 2015, but those weren't really heavily traded for a variety of reasons. That changed in December of 2017. In December of 2017, two of the largest derivatives exchanges, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade, listed Bitcoin futures contracts. Those contracts have been much more heavily traded, and it really was those listings, so December of 2017, that really brought Bitcoin squarely into the world of the CFTC. Those Bitcoin futures contracts and the Bitcoin derivatives that aren't as heavily traded, so I'll focus on the Bitcoin futures that are at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, we call that CME, and the Chicago Board of Trade. Those are the only federally regulated Bitcoin products, Bitcoin traded products in the United States. So I know we have some real experts in the audience, but we also have some lay people too, so permit me just a minute of background on Bitcoin. I'm happy to go into more detail if folks have questions, but Bitcoin is a decentralized network that relies on a peer-to-peer system rather than on banks or credit card companies to verify the transactions on Bitcoin's distributed ledger, which is called the blockchain. Remember the double spend problem? The point of the virtual currencies is to try to eliminate the intermediary. That's what Bitcoin attempts to do. The first Bitcoin was mined in 2009 after the anonymous person or group named Satoshi Nakamoto published a proof of concept for a currency that uses cryptocurrency rather than using those third parties. If Satoshi Nakamoto is here, you can come up and I'll give you the mic. All right, don't be shy. If you're here, you can come up anytime. So Bitcoin miners contribute computing resources to verify Bitcoin transactions and to maintain the blockchain. They're compensated for sharing their computing resources with new Bitcoin. The total number of Bitcoin to be mined is limited, so it's capped at 21 million. And estimates right now are that it would reach its cap in about 2140. After that, miners will be compensated with transaction fees, not with Bitcoin. So that's a little bit of background about the CFTC, a little bit of background about Bitcoin. One thing that I'll say, though, about the intersection of the two is I think that the fact that these innovative Bitcoin products have developed in the CFTC's jurisdiction actually isn't surprising. The statutory and regulatory structure of the CFTC is a little bit unique. It's designed to ensure that the development of new and innovative products can actually take place. And it's designed to ensure that that development isn't going to be hampered by cautious regulators who are worried about the political consequences of allowing new products to be listed. The CFTC's regulatory structure encourages market-driven innovation. In fact, we get about 1,000 new products listed each year in our markets. And that product innovation flows directly from the CFTC's statutory and regulatory regime, which relies on clearly stated principles and outcome-focused high-level guideposts to achieve the regulatory outcomes rather than compliance with detailed and prescriptive rules. So the way the CFTC's regulations work is they set forth high-level principles that need to be complied with rather than a list, a highly reticulated and highly prescriptive list of all the different rules. This principles-based approach may seem like a small point, but it's not. It's what, in my view, has led the CFTC to be a place, and the CFTC's markets to be a place where innovation has occurred in the United States over the past several years. So how has the CFTC's jurisdiction and regulatory approach interacted with Bitcoin? I'll suggest that we at the CFTC have struck a balance. That we've struck a balance between providing a regulatory structure that market participants desire without squelching innovation in the space. This is an important point because I believe that market participants will always look to participate in well-designed regulatory frameworks. Trading counterparties, we don't think that they're looking for the most or the least regulated marketplaces, but marketplaces that have the right balance of sensible, objective, and well-maintained regulation. This is particularly true, in my view, as a market matures. I think we're seeing some demand for some regulatory presence in the ecosystem right now with respect to the Bitcoin market as it's maturing. As the market grows and it starts to gain mainstream acceptance, new participants in the market, they want comfort. They want comfort that their funds are secure, that the Bitcoin that they're purchasing actually exists, and that everybody in the marketplace is playing by the same rules. They also want to know that through their participation in this market, that they're not unwittingly facilitating some form of money laundering or other illicit activity. They want to know who they're trading with. And don't just take my word for it. It's the market participants who've come to us in the CFTC seeking to list these products, and it's these market participants who are buying and selling these Bitcoin derivatives in the regulated US markets. So it's not just my hunch that's telling us that the market's ready for some regulation in its ecosystem. Market participants are telling us that through their actions. At the same time, though, while we see a demand for some regulation in the Bitcoin ecosystem, I also appreciate that the type of regulation really matters. The regulatory response has to be properly calibrated. We have to recognize that the market for virtual currencies is a global market and that it's a nascent developing market. Just as market participants for traditional derivatives seek well-designed regulatory frameworks, so too will market participants in the Bitcoin derivatives markets. And if we don't get the regulation right, if we don't get the regulatory approach right in this global market, the market participants can go elsewhere. As we think about what the proper regulatory framework is, you can look for available analogs. One might look, I'd suggest, to the internet. 2 decades ago, as the internet was entering a phase of rapid growth and expansion, a Republican Congress and a Clinton administration, so it was bipartisan, established a set of foundational principles. The internet was to progress through human social interaction, voluntary contractual relations, and free markets. And government and regulators were to act in a thoughtful manner not to harm the internet's continuing evolution. This simple approach is well recognized as the regulatory underpinning of the internet that brought about profound changes to human society. During the almost 20 years of this do no harm regulatory approach, a massive amount of investment was made in the internet's infrastructure. It yielded a rapid expansion that supported swift deployment and mass adoption of internet-based technologies. Internet-based innovations have revolutionized nearly every aspect of our lives. And that economy has created jobs, increased productivity, fostered innovation and consumer choice. Do no harm was unquestionably the right approach for the development of the internet. Similarly, I believe that do no harm is the right overarching regulatory approach for virtual currencies and distributed ledger technology. So what does responsible do no harm regulation look like in this space? In short, do no harm regulation must be, to use a word you've heard me talk about a lot tonight, it must be balanced. It involves providing a path forward for folks who are doing it right, for folks who are committed to getting it right, but acting assertively and aggressively to root out bad actors who are doing it wrong. Just as history has taught us that innovation needs breathing room to survive, history's also taught us that bad actors will try to take advantage of new innovations and the enthusiasm that accompanies it to perpetrate age-old frauds on unsuspecting victims. Any regulatory approach must recognize the benefits, but also the risks accompanying Bitcoin, virtual currency, and distributed ledger technologies. From a market structure perspective, we of course recognize the potential benefits from these new technologies. Take distributed ledger technology. Distributed ledgers in various open systems or private network applications have the potential to enhance economic efficiency, mitigate centralized systematic risk, defend against fraudulent activity, and improve data quality and governance. Distributed ledger technology is likely to have a broad and lasting impact, I submit, on global financial markets in payments, banking, securities settlement, title recording, cybersecurity, and you can go on. When tied to virtual currencies like Bitcoin, the technology aims to serve as a new store of value, facilitate secure payments, enable asset transfers, and power new applications. This technology will likely develop hand in hand with smart contracts that can value themselves in real time, report themselves to data repositories, automatically calculate, and perform margin payments, and even terminate themselves in the event of counterparty default. Particularly relevant here, given that I'm coming to this from a regulatory perspective, this technology may enable financial market participants to manage the significant operational, transactional, and capital complexities brought about by the many mandates promulgated by regulators here and abroad in the wake of the financial crisis. Many other use cases for this technology are being developed, from international trade to charitable efforts in social services. Just recently, the big agricultural commodity merchant Louis Dreyfus and a group of financing banks just completed the first agricultural deal using distributed ledger technology for the sale of 60,000 tons of soybeans to China. Other distributed ledger use cases that we're seeing include legal records management, inventory control and logistics, charitable donation tracking and confirmation, voting security, and even human refugee identification and tracking. Yet, while distributed ledger technology promises enormous benefits to commercial firms and charities, it also promises assistance to financial market regulators in meeting our core mission to oversee markets and mitigate financial risk. What a difference it would have made if on the eve of the financial crisis in 2008, if we had access to real-time trading ledgers of Wall Street banks, rather than trying to assemble piecemeal data to recreate complex individual trading portfolios. If regulators in 2008 could have viewed a real-time distributed ledger, they may have been able to recognize anomalies in the market-wide trading activity and diverging counterparty exposures, indicating heightened risk of bank failure. This type of technology, had it existed then, it might not have saved Lehman Brothers or halted the financial crisis, but it certainly would have allowed for far prompter, better informed, and more calibrated regulatory intervention instead of the disorganized response that unfortunately ensued. Now, I recognize that that's not a point that I need to belabor here, because Puerto Rico, unfortunately, is undergoing a similar crisis as we stand here today. So as regulators, we have to recognize the benefits that can be achieved through Bitcoin, through virtual currencies, through digital ledger technology, distributed ledger technology. But we'd be foolish if we also didn't recognize the risks. There are operational risks accompanying the largely unregulated and unsupervised Bitcoin cash trading market. There are cybersecurity risks of trading platforms, virtual currency wallets, and digital ledgers that can be hacked if not properly secured. There are speculative risks of volatile price moves, and there are fraud and manipulation risks through traditional market abuses like pump and dump schemes, insider trading, false disclosure, Ponzi schemes, and the like. One of the things that we're seeing is bad actors in this space trying to take advantage of the enthusiasm that the public has surrounding some of these products and employing the same old school fraudulent techniques to try to capture that enthusiasm and defraud customers. But it's because we recognize these real benefits and these real risks that a balanced approach, this do no harm approach, I think is the best one. So here's how we've tried to do it at the CFTC. We defined Bitcoin as a commodity in 2015, as I said. We also have worked hard to develop expertise in this area. We've done it largely through what we call Lab CFTC. Lab CFTC is the focal point at the CFTC for the technology and innovation policy for those considerations and development. It serves as the hub for our engagement with the innovation community. It supports our broader efforts to transform the CFTC into a modern digital service provider. It's intended to bridge the gap between where we are today and where we need to be, which is the 21st century regulator for 21st century digital markets. So at the CFTC, we're committed to a regulatory culture of forward thinking, to becoming more accessible to emerging technology innovators, to discover ways to harness and benefit from financial technology innovation, and to become more responsive to our rapidly changing markets. So we do this in part through Lab CFTC. They serve as our in-house experts. They're holding office hours all around the country. They're speaking at conferences. They're meeting with innovators. They're taking the ideas from innovators and they're passing it on to the regulators to make sure that we're not just sitting cloistered in our silos without having interaction with the real people who have the boots on the ground. And so one example of how we're trying to facilitate, not hinder market-enhancing developments, is the listing of the Bitcoin futures products that I talked about earlier. This, as I said, has provided the first fully regulated Bitcoin product in the United States. And I expect that there are going to be other developments and innovations in our jurisdiction in the near future. At the same time, however, we've aggressively pursued fraudsters and other bad actors. We filed a number of cases involving fraudulent Bitcoin investment schemes, fraud in connection with Bitcoin and Litecoin trading funds, and fraud in connection with other smaller, lesser-known virtual currencies, such as one called MyBigCoin, which was intended to sound like Bitcoin, and another one called ATM Coin. This, I think, demonstrates how we're trying to pursue this balanced approach at the CFTC. We've developed expertise in the area. We're soliciting input from the innovation community. We make clear to folks how you can do it right, what you need to do if you want to do it right and get regulatory approval. But at the same time, we crack down against those who are doing it wrong. So is it working? Well, too early to draw any conclusions at this point, any firm conclusions, but the early returns look good. We continue to see trading interest in the Bitcoin futures products in our jurisdiction. Since Bitcoin futures were listed in December of 2017, we've seen volatility in the price of Bitcoin decrease. The San Francisco Fed just released a paper a couple of weeks ago linking this decrease in volatility to the listing of the Bitcoin futures products in December of last year. And we continue to see proposals for new virtual currency products. So at this early stage, things do look good, but we should all continue to watch this space. So I now want to open it up to questions and comments. I'd really like to hear from you guys, as I said at the beginning of this, but before I open it up, let me just leave you with a few principles that I think will summarize what I believe we as regulators should do with respect to the innovation community. I think we as regulators owe it to the innovators and to the innovation community to respect your enthusiasm for virtual currencies with a thoughtful and balanced response, not a dismissive one, to crack down hard on those who try to abuse this enthusiasm with fraud and manipulation, to thoroughly educate ourselves and the public about this new innovation, and to make good policy choices, and put in place sound regulatory frameworks to reduce the risk for consumers. I think if we do this, and we do it in a balanced way, this innovation economy and the economy of the United States and Puerto Rico will flourish. So what questions do you guys have? What can we talk about? Thank you. Yeah. So I think there's pretty broad consensus that Bitcoin, at least if you're talking, so the question was, is there any confusion about how you define Bitcoin from a regulatory standpoint? And the question specifically was, does the SEC think it's a security? Does Treasury define it as a currency? I think the answer is, right now, there's a pretty broad consensus that Bitcoin is a commodity that's regulated by the CFTC. You do see, so the IRS defines Bitcoin as property. Now, that's just because they think about whether things are property or not property. We think about things whether they're a commodity or a security. But almost all commodities would also be property. So I don't think there's any inconsistency in the IRS saying Bitcoin is property. Well, of course it's property. If somebody stole your Bitcoin, you'd go to the police and you'd say, well, somebody stole my property. Come help me get my property back. And it's intangible property, but it's property nonetheless. So I think you are seeing a pretty broad consensus that Bitcoin is a commodity. With respect to a number of other virtual currencies, though, we're in constant communication with the SEC and with the other federal regulators to make sure that we're on the same page, to make sure that we're applying the same guidelines to decide whether something's a commodity or something's a security. And so I think Bitcoin is at one end of the ledger. Everybody pretty much agrees that's a commodity. There are a number of other things at the other end of the ledger that really are capital formation, where it looks like a stock. It just happens to be a coin, or it looks like an initial public offering, but it's called an initial coin offering. The SEC has been clear, if it looks like a security, if it looks like an initial public offering, we're going to treat it as a security and you need to come register with us. So I think at the other end of the ledger, there are some pretty obvious cases where it's a security. I think in the middle, there are some hard questions, and we're working close with the SEC to try to figure out how we can give the innovation community guidance on that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What about other foreign cryptocurrencies like the Petro yuan, which I think began this year, that are pegged to the or automatically convertible to gold? Is that on the jurisdiction?
Did you say the Petro, the Venezuelan Petro?
No, the Chinese one.
Chinese.
Oh, the Chinese one.
It's automatically convertible to gold, and
right.
Perhaps that could be
fall
under your definition of a commodity.
And so there are others that are automatically convertible or are tied to the U.S. dollar or things like that. So
right.
There are a number of them that are pegged to different things. With respect to each of them, we look at them and we undertake the same analysis. We look at it. We look at how it's used. We look at how it's designed, and is it a store of value, unit of account, medium of exchange, or is it something that looks like it's intended to raise money, like an initial coin offering? And I'll give you just one sort of easy way to think about it, or a way that we think about it. So there's a test that's based on a Supreme Court case called Howey, which is the test that effectively determines or gives us the guidelines as to how we determine whether something is a security or not. Right. And if it's not a security, then it's likely going to be a commodity. And I'm sort of paraphrasing here, or this is high level, but it's essentially, it's a security if you have insiders who are working and engaging in entrepreneurial or managerial efforts to try to advance an enterprise to earn profits for outside investors. And so one of the hallmarks of the securities regime and of securities regulation is this asymmetry of information between the insiders and the outsiders. And so you look at the securities regulations, they're very heavily based on disclosure. So it's disclosure trying to correct for that asymmetry of information to make sure that the insiders aren't taking advantage of that insider advantage for their benefit at the detriment of everybody else. Commodities, we don't really have that same asymmetry of information. If you're talking about corn or wheat or oil or interest rates or Bitcoin, you don't really have insiders. And so our whole regulatory regime is a little different. It's not disclosure-based, it's principles-based. And so one way to think about it is, if Bitcoin were a security, who would even make the securities filings? Like how could Bitcoin begin to comply with the securities laws? But if you've got something that actually is an initial coin offering, where I say, I'm the leader here, I'm the promoter, buy Jamie coin, and you can be part of my company, and we're gonna raise this money to go build a building downtown or whatever we're gonna use it for, then you kind of know, okay, this is fun, this is capital formation, this is fundraising, and I'm the person, me and the other insiders who have the inside information, we're the ones who have to file the securities disclosures.
And finally, my last question. How would that differ from a cryptocurrency that is defined as a currency under treasury laws?
So the definition of currency requires a state backer. Okay. And so maybe the reason I was wondering whether you're talking about the Venezuelan petro is because that one may be a currency if you have a state backer. But under the treasury definition, even if it's used as a medium of exchange, if it's not backed by a nation state, then it won't be classified as a currency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are U.S. retail investors allowed to
Are U.S. retail investors allowed to participate in U.S. ICOs? And I have another question too.
So to the extent it's an ICO, it would be regulated by the SEC, and so that's a question for the SEC. I mean, I will say, depending on how it's structured, in a hypothetical scenario, I don't think that there's any absolute prohibition on U.S. customers participating. If, for example, an ICO really were a security, and if they properly registered as a security, then I think there are ways that U.S. retail customers could participate, but I think that's probably not the question you're asking.
The second question would be on SAFT. Is that no longer a good option?
So no, the disclaimer is the disclaimer I gave at the beginning was these are my views, not necessarily the views of the CFTC. Okay. The other disclaimer I should now give is I'm not offering legal advice. I think you have to ask either your lawyer or somebody at the SEC whether SAFTs are a good idea.
My question is related to how the cryptocurrency is treated, and is it viewed, for example, under the case of CFTC versus Monex. Monex is not treated as, well, it is a commodity because it's metal exchange, but the way that it was solved the case, it can be similarly applied to what is cryptocurrency. What is your view on that?
Right. So the question is referring to a case, CFTC versus Monex, that was recently decided by a federal court in California. Mm-hmm. And that court interpreted our enforcement jurisdiction to cover manipulation with respect to commodities or fraud that had a manipulative component, not pure fraud. There are a number of other cases across the country, including a virtual currency case, CFTC versus McDonald, that was decided in the Eastern District of New York by Judge Weinstein, that took the opposite position. And so that's where we're studying the Monex decision, and we're comparing it with the other decisions and figuring out the path.
As well as the CFTC versus Saunter Wise.
That's okay. Right, you've done your homework.
Yes, I have.
in CFTC versus Kraft.
Gracias. Hi. When you were speaking about risk, you mentioned Bitcoin Cash. Would you define it, and why would the regulators consider it a risk?
So I should be, I'm sorry if I wasn't talking about Bitcoin Cash, the fork of Bitcoin.
Oh, okay.
I was talking about the Bitcoin Cash market. So in the derivatives world, we often talk about futures, swaps, derivatives on the one hand, and the cash, or sometimes you call it spot market, on the other hand. So if you were to open an account and just buy or sell pure Bitcoin, that is not a Bitcoin derivative. We would say that's the Bitcoin cash market. Cash for Bitcoin right now, or spot, meaning it's the spot market traded on the spot. The derivatives market is a future, for example, we enter a futures contract, you have to give me 1 Bitcoin in 30 days at whatever the prevailing price for Bitcoin is 30 days from now. So I say that there's a potential risk is the fact that the underlying market, so the Bitcoin Cash market, not Bitcoin Cash, the virtual currency, but that the Bitcoin Cash market is largely unregulated. And I think that's a risk that regulators are thinking about.
Does the FTC consider Ethereum a commodity?
So, just as I said before, we're taking a virtual currency by virtual currency approach to these, and we're conducting an analysis of a lot of different virtual currencies. The CFTC has not said one way or the other whether Ethereum is a commodity, just as the SEC hasn't said whether it's a security, which is probably the answer you knew you were going to get from me, but I can't say any more here. You got a couple questions down. Oh. Yeah, I can hear you, I think.
A market where actual delivery occurred, where there was actual delivery, whether you would consider that an exchange, or would that just be a mercantile market?
So, so the question is about the CFTC's rules on actual delivery as it applies to virtual currency. So on that, we actually issued, I think this may be what you're referring to, we issued proposed guidance, or proposed guidance, and we asked for notice and comment on that guidance. We got a bunch of comments which are publicly available, and our team in the policy division now is reviewing those, and I expect there will be final guidance that will be issued soon. The question is, if there is actual delivery, would we view that as an exchange? And I think we would just have to look at it under the rules. So the actual delivery rules, even if there was delivery, if there was some other reason why it would fit under our jurisdiction, for example, if it were a very short-term future or something like that, or if it still fit under if there were actual delivery, it wouldn't fit under the leverage margin or finance provision that would trigger our jurisdiction, but there may be other reasons. So we need to know a little more about it. But I think if it were actually delivered and it didn't fit within our jurisdiction for in any other way, it would be part of that cash or spot market. Yeah.
Hello. This may be very basic, but just to understand, an ICO can be seen as a securities offering. That's correct, right? That's how the SEC is looking at them?
It can be, yes.
It can be. Then the ensuing coin that comes out of that is a commodity. It's not necessarily a security by itself. and then if it's traded in the futures market or in any of the derivatives, it's subject to the CFTC. So in between, it is what, cash type market that you're referring to? Because it seems to be, I'm not sure why the ICO is different than the ultimate trading here, and maybe you have some insight on how that works.
So that's not a basic question, that's a great question. And I think that's, it depends on the actual case. It's really, really hard to answer that question in the abstract. The question of if something starts as an initial coin offering that would be a security, but then, let's say, for example, it starts as not decentralized, but with actual insiders who are trying to work on behalf of an entrepreneurial enterprise, and then over the life of the coin, it truly becomes decentralized, and it actually is operating as something that looks a little more like a commodity. Then, yeah, that scenario is something that regulators need to think hard about. And it's something, I think, one of the things that I didn't talk about, but is the potential overlapping jurisdiction among the different federal regulators. So it's not just the CFTC and the SEC, but it's Treasury, it's FinCEN, it's the FTC, it's all of the different states, it's the Department of Justice, it's the FBI, and it's the IRS. And everybody has a little bit of a different stake in it. And so one thing that I think the public has a right to expect from us is that we're going to be coordinated, and that we're going to be talking to one another, and that we're going to be working through these hard issues together. So in that scenario, what we want to avoid is a situation where the SEC says this thing is a security all the way through, and we have jurisdiction, and you, innovation community, you have to comply with our regulations, and the CFTC is saying this is a commodity, we have jurisdiction, you have to comply with ours, and Treasury is treating it as something else, and the IRS is treating it as even something else. So we want to avoid a situation where there are inconsistent pronouncements from the federal regulatory community. Also want to avoid a scenario where everybody said, so we want to avoid a scenario where there are overlapping but inconsistent approaches. We also want to avoid a scenario where there's underlap. And we want to make sure that if that falls in our court, that we know it, that it's clear, and that we know that we're responsible for it. If it falls in somebody else's court, we want to make sure that they know that too. So, so it is, I think your question highlights the need for the federal regulators to be very closely coordinated on these types of issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just another question. You've spoken about Bitcoin, and a gentleman referred to Ethereum, and there are a number of virtual currencies that are in that same manner, Ripple, Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash that you mentioned. How does the CFTC view the establishment of an exchange where those commodities are traded? Does that fall under the regulatory purview of the CFTC, and how would it be treated?
So, speaking to the mic here. So we need to know more. If it weren't a derivatives contract, then it likely wouldn't fall under our regulatory jurisdiction. It could potentially fall under our enforcement jurisdiction if there were fraud or manipulation on the platform. But if you're talking about just pure, what I've talked about as cash or spot transactions that are on-platform transactions, then that's not something that we have regulatory jurisdiction over.
So I'm specifically thinking about things like Coinbase and Bitfinex and that type.
Yes,
where
we're not the regulator for Coinbase and Bitfinex. We're the regulator for CME and the Chicago Board of Trade and NYMEX and some of the others that have listed virtual currency derivatives products.
And another question, and then I'll give up the mic, because everybody has questions. One of the thornier issues surrounding virtual currencies and virtual currency transactions and blockchain or distributed ledger technology is the compliance regime that's in the U.S. All of the the entities that you mentioned and the different laws, the anti-money laundering laws, BSA, OFAC, all of those, and how we get actors to comply with the existing regulation. I have a view that compliance is not optional, that we can have a conversation on how you can comply, and that's where I think things like the distributed ledger may have promise for compliance, but the compliance isn't optional. But that's one of the very worrisome parts of this market.
You're absolutely right. So when I think about compliance under the current regulatory regime, I think about things that are very clear that I think everybody who's operating under the U.S. regulatory regime knows that they have to do. So Bank Secrecy Act, you've got to comply with it. You've got to file suspicious activity reports. You've got to have anti-money laundering rules in place. You've got to follow the Know Your Customer provisions. And so I think you're right. That type of compliance is not optional, but it's I think each of the platforms that you would be thinking about in the U.S. would be registered with FinCEN, for example, which is which is the entity within the Department of Treasury that's looking for financial improprieties and reviewing the Bank Secrecy Act and the suspicious activity report filings. And I think each of them, unless you're thinking of one that I'm not, would be registered with FinCEN as a money transmitter. And so they'd be required to submit all of those things to FinCEN. And so part of our job is to make sure that FinCEN knows what we're seeing and that we know what they're seeing, and that if there are participants in our market. So one of the reasons that we talk about the difference between the cash market and the derivatives market, or one reason that we talk about enforcement jurisdiction, this is back to the question we just got about Monex, the enforcement jurisdiction being touching on the cash market, is because one way that you could potentially manipulate a market is to conduct trading in one market to benefit a position in a related market. So the derivatives market is, of course, related to the underlying cash market, and if we're going to effectively police the derivatives market, we need the authority to be able to see what's happening and actually police the cash market too. So it's important for us to be able to have access to the kinds of things that the other regulators who are looking into this are seeing, and that includes, by the way, the states. A number of these different platforms are registered with the states under the different state money transmitter laws, and so frankly, a lot of my job is just making sure that we have the relationships in place. If we need memorandas of understanding or access letters or things like that, that those are in place, and making sure that there's a seamless flow of information among the different federal regulators. Because as I said in response to the question earlier, I think it's absolutely not an answer for me to say to the American public, well, sorry, we didn't have that information, it was elsewhere in the government. I think everybody fairly expects that if there's information in the government that we should have access to, that we're getting it, and that we're using it for to make sure that our markets are operating with the integrity that they should. Do you have one more question? Yeah.
I would imagine that the transactions involving cryptocurrencies are regular contract transactions regulated by regular state law.
Right.
Is there any preemption in your federal regulations over state laws that could be part of the cryptocurrency transactions?
So in some spaces, yes. It's not like there's a wholesale preemption of all cryptocurrency transactions, though when we're talking about the different regulatory regimes, there clearly is a role for the states under the current regulatory regime because they're not preempted right now. And if you think about the transactions that are being conducted on Coinbase or Bitfinex or Poloniex or wherever it's conducted, those are conducted under both federal and state law. There's not preemption right now. Yeah.
At the beginning, you did mention that some countries had banned the cryptocurrency.
I'm sorry?
At the beginning of,
Right.
you did mention that some countries have banned cryptocurrency. Now, there is a controversy and a concern of countries when it comes to fiat money. Should it be treated, the cryptocurrency, as a commodity or a form of currency because of that concern?
So I think, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think under the current regime, if the cryptocurrency were not state-backed, then it wouldn't be treated as a currency, because that's a condition of having, right now, under the current rules, to be a currency, traditional currency or fiat currency, that means backed by a state. And so even if it's a medium of exchange but not backed by a state, then under the US regulatory regime, we wouldn't treat it as a currency, we treat it as something else. Now, now you're back to the question of, okay, you conduct the Howey analysis and the SEC and the CFTC talk to one another, and we work hard to figure it out. But I think that's how we'd approach the issue.
Okay, it's just that one of the concerns is that most of the countries think that the fiat money will be replaced by the cryptocurrency. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll come back in 10 years and we'll see where we are.
All right.
I mean, by the way,
Fair enough.
So the price of Bitcoin, as I came up here, was just a little over $8,000, right? So raise your hand. You got to raise your hand to one of these two things. Who thinks in 5 years' time the price of Bitcoin is going to be higher than $8,000? Yeah, 8,000 US dollars. So if I bought a Bitcoin today and I sold it 5 years from now, I buy it today for $8,000. Am I selling it 5 years from now for more than $8,000? If you think more, raise your hand. If you think less, raise your hand. Now, some of you guys didn't vote. I said everybody's got to raise their hand. What was that? Like,
Well, the thing is that your question is, as I view it, either you see the cryptocurrency as a security or as a commodity, because if you're going to sell the value of what you have, when it comes a capital exchange, so either you view the cryptocurrency as a security when it comes to that question, or you view the cryptocurrency as a commodity when it comes to exchange. So I don't know if I'm getting my point through.
no, I think, so I think that's right. I think with respect to cryptocurrencies that don't have state backing, they likely would either be a security or commodity. They'd likely fit within one of those categories. There may be one that, there may be some that don't fit in either category, but I think for the most part, that's probably right.
It's just that each value is very volatile right now because people think that is a form of exchange or security that
Right.
you invest on. Sorry, I'm sorry about that. It's just that since people view the Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, whichever, as a form of exchange or a security to invest on, just to raise capital.
Right.
Well, if they view it as a commodity just for the purpose of transaction, when China just established in 2000, I don't remember which year, but they did establish the trend that Bitcoin was solely and formally just for transaction purpose,
Right.
not as a security or as an exchange. But if you try to come up with the question when it comes to either I exchange what I just bought as a value, a digital value, and it raises my capital because I exchange it because now it's valued as 18,000, and I bought it for $1,
Right.
then you have
bought a lot.
raised capital.
Right. So let me be clear. It's not just about, it's not about whether you make money or not. It's about whether you are trying to raise capital for the purpose of an enterprise, for the purpose of some sort of thing that looks like a company, and that you are the person who's the management or the entrepreneurial leader of that company. And if you're raising, I say raising capital in the securities law sense of capital formation, trying to go to the outside world and get other people to invest in this thing that I'm building. I'm thinking of that as different from investing in whatever you might invest in, whether it's gold, silver, wheat, or Bitcoin. And if the price goes up, you make money. In one sense, you've raised capital because you've made money. I should be clear, when I say raise capital, I mean the way we think about it often in the US securities law context of going out, capital fundraising, going out and talking to a bunch of people, trying to get them to give us money for the purpose of some, to advance some enterprise that, because I'm the manager of it, I have information about it that others don't. But thanks for getting me to clarify that.
Thank you.
Anything else? Oh, one more.
Are you concerned in any way that the way the regulators in the United States are dealing with the cryptocurrencies will result in innovation coming from other countries and the United States missing on the train, basically, of a new technology that will change the world?
So I think we have to recognize that this is a global market, and I think we have to recognize that if we don't get it right, that there's a chance, just as with any market, that market participants could go elsewhere. And so the do no harm principle that I articulated at the beginning, I think, is a good guiding principle, but it's not. It can't be the end, because if we're not in a position where we're coming up with the right regulatory regime, then yeah, it's possible. It's possible that some of that innovation could go elsewhere. I mean, I will say though that I think if you look at the U.S. markets and the way that the U.S. markets have developed, and one reason that the U.S. markets have developed as one of the centers for financial innovation, I think it's in part because we've had a balanced regulatory approach. I think it's because there's a strong norm of enforcement and of rule following, and you know that when there are laws and rules in place, the rule of law is going to be followed, and you know that the different market participants are going to be playing by the same rules. So I'm confident that that's where we're going to be. Yeah.
More or less. Are you anywhere near regulating the exchanges of those commodities?
So we don't have, under the law,
I know.
we can't regulate what I'm calling the cash platforms.
Yes.
We are regulating the futures platforms, and I think I think those markets are growing. I think one of the things that we'll see is our market participants looking for more regulated markets, and if they are, I think you might see them moving to the derivatives markets. The question of who should be the primary regulator of the cash markets is, they let me run the enforcement division, but they don't let me write the laws. So,
but how do you feel about the alternate trading systems, these platforms? Are they of any concern to you?
So if they were true sort of ATS, alternate trading systems that were registered, they could potentially be registered with the SEC. It's something that we look at. We look at the trading on the underlying cash platforms because they feed into the price discovery process and the derivatives markets. And so I think it's something that we're looking at. I don't know that I'd say it's a concern, but it's something that's absolutely kind of front of mind.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Oh.
So we're working on a project that is a piece of hardware, a storage device, and it's decentralized. And there will be access to apps to that will be uploaded to the device through the blockchain. So the company is creating a DApp, and we'll have a token launch, aka ICO. There's complete functionality to the token, and the token's not being sold to raise capital. Actually, this company, it went through crowdfunding regulations, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if you're saying yes because you know the company or the product.
I'm mostly saying yes because I think I'm going to give you an answer ultimately that's going to be unsatisfying to you. But
no, I know. I pretty much or expect the answer you'd give, but there's a strong argument here.
Answer, by the way, but I can't answer that. I'm sure it's going to be the answer, but.
No. Well, okay, great then. But would that fall under that this blanket we continue to hear that all ICOs are considered securities?
So, I mean, I can't answer that. The way that the way that I would go about answering it would be to take all of the information about the company and about the product. I'd take it back to the CFTC. We'd go through a rigorous analytical process with our product design team and our Division of Market Oversight. We'd talk to all of the other different federal regulators who might have an interest. We'd try to get as much information as we could, and then we'd ultimately come to a decision.
It's being consulted, but it's more an SEC concern than on the CFTC side, of course.
Right. I mean,
yeah.
I sort of understand that to be part of the premise of the question, but yeah, that's how we think about it.
Okay. Thank you.
Are we done? All right. One more. Well, last one. All right, last question. I thought we had a 3-question limit.
I'm over already.
No regulations.
This is what happens with no regulation.
Yeah.
We need some balanced regulation here.
You mentioned this is a world market.
I don't believe I don't like quotas, so that's why we're.
You mentioned this is a world market. What extraterritorial jurisdiction does your agency have, if any, over ICOs that are issued outside the U.S.?
So if they're pure ICOs, and then they're likely to be securities, and the answer is we don't have much jurisdiction because they would fall under the SEC's jurisdiction, regardless of whether they were domestic or international. We do have some. Our statute does allow for some extraterritorial application in the commodities context. We would need to have a U.S. nexus. And
like what? Like it's part of it is sold in the U.S. or?
So it could be U.S. customers. It could be trading on a U.S. platform. So it could be foreign entities or companies trading on a U.S. platform. It could be foreign companies soliciting U.S. individuals. It could be international companies that have a presence in the U.S. But if you're talking about purely foreign conduct, purely foreign activity, purely foreign exchange, we would have to look really hard to see whether we had any jurisdiction over that type of conduct. But your question is a good one. The international or global component of the market is something that's a challenge, and it's something that not just, even if we've got jurisdiction, we need to then go talk to the foreign regulators to get access to the information. We need to make sure that we've got all of the relevant evidence so that ultimately when we bring a case in the United States, we have access to everything regardless of where it happened. And by the way, this is similar to my answer about the need for coordination among the U.S. regulators. I don't think it's an answer either to say, okay, well, companies can be international, and if you're just an international company, you can use that as a defense to regulation or to enforcement. I think it's incumbent upon us to have the relationships with the foreign countries so that we can make sure that you can't evade detection or evade enforcement or evade regulation just by being just by having businesses that span over multiple countries. And this is something we work hard on. I was in I was in London 2 weeks ago for a week of meetings with foreign regulators where we were talking about these very things. So it's something that we're making sure we've got the groundwork laid. But the international component of it is a challenge. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Amy, thank you very much. La academia les invita a compartir un vino de honor aquí en la parte de afuera del teatro. Muchas gracias por asistir y buenas noches.